thanks again for joining us this evening. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I'm so thrilled that you're all here for a subject that's near and dear to my heart. In addition to being an ADHD executive function and academic coach, I think my most important role is mom. I'm a mom of a 23-year-old boy, a son with ADHD. And so I've been a researcher. I've been an advocate for him throughout his life. And so it's, I hope to be able to share with you the lessons I've learned with my son, in addition to the knowledge I've gained from all my training as an ADHD executive function coach. So a little bit about my philosophy. I use Ross Greene's philosophy that our kids would if they could. So throughout this presentation, while you're going to hear challenges that ADHD presents, I also want to make sure that we start off our presentation with some strengths, because our children, really would do well, if they could. So we're going to be talking about lagging skills. We're going to be talking about brain activation, and we're going to be talking about executive functions to help you create a more complete picture of your child. And so by the end of this, I'm hoping that you understand that ADHD is a neurological brain-based disorder of self-regulation and self-management, which sets our kids up to have certain experiences, but we can also support our children in a way where they can have equally as many successes. So I'm going to, oops, that's not working. Let me just go. No, the other bar wasn't working. Okay, so I'm going to start here with the negative messaging. I think this is just really kind of telling and shocking for many people to hear that our kids by the age of 12 have received 20,000 more negative messages than their quote unquote neurotypical peers. Because of that, a lot of our kids have started to develop this sense of self as being impaired, flawed, not good enough. And when that continues, that can have dramatic impacts throughout their schooling and into their adulthood. I work with adults as well, and a lot of the adults I work with have kept some of this shame and this guilt for not being able to do things in a certain way or not be able to follow through. So if we can start when our kids are younger, then we're able to set them up for more success when they go into their adulthood. So I do want to start off with you looking at your child and celebrating the child that you do have. I know as parents, sometimes we take a step back and just say, I wish it weren't so hard. I wish this could be different. I wish. And that's fine. We're humans, right? Absolutely. But we want to talk about celebrating the child that you do have. If I were to hold up my hand, and I considered my fist ADHD, and I put it straight in front of me, all I would see of my child is his or her ADHD. But if I allowed my child to step back and put his or her hand down by her side, I would see ADHD as just one part of my unique child. So as you're looking through the list, start to think about what strengths your child might have, because usually we use those strengths to build what I call workarounds, or the strategies to help offset areas of weakness. So our kids are often never boring, right? Our kids are often very enthusiastic, high energy, and curious. I'll never forget, I was working with one student, and we were actually outside at that time because this student in particular liked to move. And he found things on the ground that I think 99.999% of us would have missed. And that's just so telling. I see that over and over and over again, how our kids pick up these little details that most of us would just kind of walk by or just naturally miss. So a lot of our kids do have a good sense of humor. A lot of our kids, especially, this is one area of my son's strength, is this sense sense of social justice. And I don't know whether that's from his experiences growing up or how he ended up coming at that. But he has an incredible sense of social justice, which I just love watching him develop. So let's go on and continue to turn ADHD on its head. So yes, we get exhausted sometimes because we are parents. Our kids might be hyperactive. They might be strong-willed. They even might be a daredevil, right? But if we think about turning ADHD on its head, we can take that hyperactivity and see it as full of energy, right? We can take our strong-willed child and see, wow, that's their persistence in there, their tenaciousness is there. That daredevil may be one of the top rescuers, in the fire department or in a military branch. So if we're able to stop and take what sometimes we would think is maybe a more negative aspect of ADHD and turn it on its head, we're able to kind of turn that into a more positive way to see our child. And if we help our kids understand that, they can then continue to build on those strengths. Dr. Hollowell, who wrote Driven to Distraction, one of the head gurus of ADHD, talks about creativity as impulsivity gone right. And it truly is, right? In order to be really creative, we just have to let go, and we just do, for the most part, when it comes to art and other creative adventures. So we're going to start to talk about what is ADHD, and we're going to start with an overview and get, more and more and more technical as we come, go through this presentation. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and I will do my best to answer them at the end. If for some reason we don't get to it or I don't know the answer, I will absolutely get back to you with that answer. So what is ADHD? ADHD is an invisible, complex, really misunderstood disorder. In order to start this program, I just want to let you know that I'll sometimes be using other terms like ADD or an ADHD or ADD just to simplify when I'm relaying some information to you. But the diagnostic manual now refers to ADHD as ADHD. It no longer separates ADD from ADHD. And a lot of my parents will still call and say, hi, my child has ADD. He doesn't have the H. He doesn't have the hyperactivity. And while that might be true, he may not have the physical hyperactivity. It's probably a good bet that that child has the mental hyperactivity that we find with so many of our inattentive children. So what is ADHD? It's a neurobiological disorder. And so what does neurobiological mean when we're really talking about that? It means that ADHD has its basis both in the structure of the brain and the neurochemical elements of the brain. So because of these structural differences, some are finding that there's an overall structural difference of the volume of the brain. Others are seeing in certain key areas of the brain, there's a difference in volume. But regardless of what the different researchers are finding, this neurobiological disorder affects one's capacity to self-manage and self-regulate, which means they'll have a harder time attending to certain tasks. They'll have a harder time inhibiting different behaviors or regulating their activity levels. So I just want, again, to get a basis. ADHD affects both children and adults. It's often genetically transmitted. So I get so many parents calling me and say, oh, by the way, I got diagnosed with ADHD when my child got diagnosed with ADHD because of that genetic component. The symptoms of ADHD are pervasive, chronic, and excessive. So we often hear people say, well, I have ADHD. I couldn't focus, right? It's not that they really have ADHD unless it meets that criteria. And in order to be diagnosed, you would take your student to some place. Sometimes the pediatricians will actually diagnose diagnosed children, but regardless, they have to meet certain criteria from the DSM-5. So the DSM-5 is updated, and they break ADHD into 3 subgroups. They do predominantly inattentive type, they do a predominantly impulsive and hyperactive type, and they do predominantly combined type. So combined type would be the inattentive, the hyperactivity, and the impulsivity. So as you're looking over, those are just some behaviors that you might see. If your child is inattentive, you might see them kind of off in a dreamlike state or having difficulty following directions. If your child is hyperactive, you might see them moving all around and having to wiggle and having all this energy. And if you see that your child is impulsive, you might see where they blurt words out and it's not their turn to talk. They might be sitting at the dinner table and somebody else is talking and then they said, but wait. That's where the impulsivity comes in. Or your child kind of just jumps into activities with 2 feet is another way to describe that impulsivity. So many
recording is on.
And in that optimal state, that's where the brain is most engaged in learning. So your child, when they're at home trying to do homework, you might see them doodling. And some kids refer to that in the classroom as listening art, as they kind of doodle little pictures while they're listening to their teacher. You might see your child tapping their feet or wiggling their legs or just constantly moving and squirming in your seat. Or you might see that your child wants to have something in his or her hands so that they are able to provide enough sensory input to the brain that will then create that optimal level of alertness. So let's go and let's talk a little bit, because the brain has a different, unique brain wiring. Again, going back to both the structure of the brain and the neurochemistry of the brain. So ADHD is a challenge of executive functions. And let me just say for right now, these executive functions are the control center of the brain, okay? If you think of an airport and you think of the air traffic control center, that's what the executive functions are. They're located right here for the most part in that prefrontal cortex of the brain. And we're going to get more in depth in that in just a minute. But ADHD is a challenge of brain stimulation. Again, there has to be this opportune, or there has to be this appropriate level of alertness. Without that level of alertness, the brain could start to dysregulate, again, either off the charts one way or off the charts the other, like over hyper dysregulation or a very slow bored dysregulation. And it's interesting because some kids and adults actually describe like when their brain starts to dysregulate over to the side of boredom. That boredom is like a canary in the mining shaft, right? It's telling the brain that, wait a minute, there's not enough stimulation. We need to do something quickly because I'm starting to get bored. And often our kids describe boredom, and some of our adults describe boredom as being physically painful, which I think is something unique to ADHD and something that a lot of people don't understand. Like, how can it be physically painful to be bored? But over and over again, you'll hear people talk about that in this ADHD realm. ADHD is a challenge of pausing. Our kids are kind of always on the go, whether mentally hyperactive, physically hyperactive. Sometimes they don't take a breath, right? They don't stop long enough to try to figure out what the next best choice is. And as I said earlier today, I truly believe Teaching our kids how to take a pause is probably the biggest gift we can give them, just because they're either cognitively hyperactive, physically hyperactive. In order to be able to choose or create a choice of what they want to do next, they have to be able to pause and then create a choice point, what I call a choice point. As soon as they pause and stop that behavior, that opens up a window for them, with your help at times, to say, what should I be doing next? Am I doing the right thing now? Where should I be going? What's my goal? And they can't do that without the pausing. And that doesn't come naturally to most people with ADHD. It's a challenge of pressure. So when a student is perceiving pressure, or I should say the pressure is either real or perceived, the executive functions tend to shut down, and then the student isn't able to access those higher cognitive skills. It's a challenge of knowing versus doing. ADHD is all about productivity. It's all about the doing piece. Our kids can learn and learn and learn and learn, but then they have a hard time getting into that doing piece to show just how much they've learned. ADHD is a challenge of interest. This brain is wired for interest over importance any day. So the ADHD brain is constantly scanning the environment for something more interesting than what's currently happening. Unless they're so hyper-focused into something that they already love doing, then they're not scanning that environment. Like I'm thinking of video games, right? If they're so hyper-focused in that, the brain is adequately stimulated and it's not going to go seeking other input. If they're not highly interested, then the brain is going to go seeking other input. So it's a challenge of self-regulation, being able to stop and control oneself. It's a challenge of momentum. We often talk about that prefrontal cortex that we need in order to get through the day, those executive functions, as being more sleepy. So it takes our kids some time to sometimes wake up in the morning. It takes them time at times to get started into their homework. And it's also a challenge of energy management. It's really hard for our kids to stay focused or really try hard to focus every day. And so we often see our kids coming home absolutely depleted because they have tried to hold it together all day. So one of the handouts we sent out was the ADHD iceberg, and I'm just going to pull mine out too. So what we see above the surface, right, for ADHD, if we were to look at a classroom, we could see some impulsivity happening. We could see some hyperactivity happening. We could definitely see some inattention happening. But it's what happens below the surface that's particularly interesting. And it's everything below the surface that leads to that inattention, hyperactivity, or impulsivity. So again, below the surface, if you look at that sheet, we have coexisting or comorbid conditions like anxiety, depression, bipolar, OCD, and ODD. ADHD, it's often said, rarely travels alone. We usually see it traveling with anxiety or depression, or anxiety and depression, or anxiety and something else. Many of our kids with ADHD have some learning issues. They have dysgraphia, dyscalculia, dyslexia. I mean, they have a bunch of different learning issues, which also impacts their success at school. They have some sleep disturbances, and we know when we haven't gotten an adequate number of hours of sleep that we don't perform at our peak the next day. And so I always tell my students, especially my college students, that unless you're going to get enough sleep, it doesn't matter what strategies and supports we're going to try to build for you, you don't have a strong foundation to put them on. And so we always want to look at our students' sleep habits, their eating habits, and all that to provide that solid foundation. And I think that it's also important to understand that this ADHD brain can be a couple of years behind. Let me just see. All right, we'll wait a minute. in the slides coming up, I do have a diagram that talks about how our kids can sometimes be 3 years behind their neurotypical peer in their areas of executive function challenge. Not all areas, right? But their areas of executive function challenge. One thing that's really hard, makes having ADHD difficult, is this deficit in the function of the dopamine reward pathway. So we all have this reward circuit in our brain that allows us to respond to rewards and look forward to rewards in the future. Dopamine is what helps all that happen. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter, or one of those chemicals, those messenger chemicals that occur in the brain. Individuals with ADHD have a deficit of this dopamine in this reward pathway, which means that if they're not inherently interested in something, there's not enough dopamine in the reward pathway to activate them to get started on the task. They're not going to find that task enough to pull them forward, to get them interested in performing the task. You and I, or the individuals without ADHD, our daily comings and goings provide us enough stimuli for the dopamine reward pathway to work just fine. But when ADHD is part of the equation, we often need to have a stronger stimulus to then engage this dopamine reward pathway so they feel they feel this reward, they feel this intrinsic reward for completing a task. That then will kick in the motivation, which will then kick in the attention centers. So when I'm working with families, something that we usually have to create is some sort of reward system. Oftentimes it's around homework, because that tends to be a pain point for a lot of families. It's hard to get the kids to sit down at the end of a long day to do homework. But homework isn't inherently interesting to many people. And so with ADHD as part of the equation, we sometimes have to create a reward system which ups the ante, ups the level of stimulation so that dopamine reward pathway can work better, and they can feel they can actually start the task because they know once it's finished, I'll get 3 points that I'm going to put towards something at the end of the week, or I'll add a pom-pom to my jar, or whatever reward system you work out, with your students. When I say this, I don't mean something that's going to be really expensive. When I work with adults, we are often finding rewards. Like, we have to gamify things for both students and adults. And so, often some of my adults will say, if I get up at 6 o'clock every morning this week, then on my way to work, I'll stop at wherever, Dunkin' Donuts, whatever it might be, and get my favorite coffee as a reward for getting up at 6 o'clock in the morning. Oh, okay. There they've given a bigger stimulus to that reward pathway that pulls them through that 6 o'clock wake up, because they're going to be getting that reward at the end of the week. So, for parents, get creative. Maybe it's making pizza on a Friday night. Maybe it's a living room picnic. Maybe it's socially distancing, staying within your bubble, but going out for Pokemon Go together as a family. Maybe it's going out not with the sleet and the snow, but maybe like a bike ride, or doing something together. Because I don't ever want a reward to have to be expensive, because that's not sustainable. But just having something different and unique is often a good enough reward. So when we look and focus, we're going to jump into these executive functions. And executive functions and intelligence are not the same thing. Okay, most of our kids are average to above average, have above average IQs, average to above average IQs. Occasionally not, but for the most part, they do. Executive function, remember, is all about the doing. It's all about the productivity. So this comic sums it up perfectly. Clearly, one of the parents is in bed, and the son goes, "Mom, I have to bring a homemade dessert for a class party tomorrow." And she's like, "What? Do you know what time it is?" And he's like, "Sorry, I forgot." And she's like, "It's okay. I have enough. I think I have the stuff to make 7-layer cookies." And he goes, "It's for Spanish class. It has to be Guatemalan." Right? This boy in this comic, I'm sure has a high IQ, above average IQ, and average IQ. It doesn't relate to his IQ. It's everything to do with the executive function. He just forgot to plan, and he forgot to let his mom or dad know that he needed to do this in enough time so that they could get the ingredients. So executive function is all about the doing. The term executive function isn't new. It's been around for quite a while. There's a bunch of different schools of thought out there, a bunch of different people researching it. You could look up Russell Barkley has some good YouTube videos on it. Tom Brown has some good YouTube videos on it. But it's an umbrella term that talks about these higher cognitive functions. Again, they're located right behind the brain, or behind the eyebrows and that prefrontal cortex. They don't work alone. They kind of integrate other parts of the brain with them, but they are things such as organizing, such as planning, self-monitoring, shifting, estimation, self-control. They involve all those things that I consider are necessary to get from point A to point B in a day. So when they're working well, we can smoothly go throughout our day because we kind of look ahead and we know what's coming up next. We can anticipate what we might need. When they're not working well, it's a much bumpier ride. Because our kids don't necessarily, if some of their executive functions aren't working well, they don't necessarily look ahead. They don't necessarily have the planning skills. They don't necessarily have the organization that makes it a nice, smooth ride for them. You might see, like, when the executive functions aren't working well, you might see tears at the end of the day because they forgot to bring stuff home from school. Or you might see them just completely, again, depleted, that energy management piece, because they've been trying so hard all day long that their executive functions are completely depleted. Here's a great graph to give you an idea of this executive function skill building. So executive functions, again, occur in that prefrontal cortex. Our brain develops from back to front. So the executive function on a neurotypical brain don't develop until mid-20s. And you can kind of see that right there, kind of going between that, 20 to 30 range is kind of that upper peak. You can see it when they're young, kind of in that 3 to 6 year range, and then getting ready to go into that middle school, high school era. But so when the ADHD is not part of the equation, we say the executive functions kind of develop in that early 20s to mid 20s. When ADHD is part of the equation, we often say that probably the executive functions aren't fully developed until the late 20s, early 30s. So it's just important to understand that these are brain systems that are continuing to develop. And as they continue to develop, we need to provide the supports to help them learn the strategies and learn the skills of how to do things. So again, here is that 3-year lag. So if we have a child who's 13, and is struggling, has an executive function challenge, and let's say planning. She is probably planning more on a 10-year-old level. So it's just important to take this delay into account because we want to meet our kids where they are. not where they are chronologically, because that will set them up for failure. But we want to meet them where they are developmentally so we can support where we need to support to help them move forward. Again, the energy management piece for these executive functions, I talk to kids all the time about this. I said, imagine a gas tank in the front of your brain. And by the end of the day, even sometimes halfway through the day, that fuel tank is getting lower and lower and lower and lower. So I work with families to try to figure out what's going to refuel that tank for their child or themselves as parents. Is it going to be letting your student sit, reading a book for 20 minutes? Is it going to be letting your student put in earbuds and listening to music for a little bit? Is it going to be getting out into green space? It was a huge green space, or nature was a huge, huge topic for this international ADHD conference I just went to virtually. What is it that this child can do that's going to help them refuel their executive function tank so that they have that self-management and self-regulation ability? So as you're thinking about your child, think about the things that the child would find kind of energizing. Again, we want to pick things that are healthy. Unfortunately, I didn't mention this, but with the teachers, but you as parents need to know that, ADHD does predispose some of our kids for different addictions. And I think that's really important to understand. And so we want to be teaching kids at an early age how to refuel their tank in a healthy way versus an unhealthy way. So what happens when these executive functions don't work? I'm sure you've seen many of these at home, probably the procrastination, that overwhelm, the poor decision making, the lack of impulse control. Our kids often have that very low self-awareness of how they're appearing or showing up in the world. And they often are highly distractible when their executive functions don't work. Rumination is another thing. We all have a negativity bias. It served us well way, way, way back when we had to constantly be on the lookout for predators. We don't have to be on the lookout for predators anymore. However, that negativity bias has remained. We often say that with the ADHD brain, this rumination piece, this negativity is just stickier. In my training, we often said that the good things slip off like Teflon, so they don't remember the good things that have happened, and and the negative sticks like Velcro. For some reason, that ADHD brain is super sticky for the things that don't go right. And so we want to help our kids get out of that rumination and help them see all the things that are going well. The black and white thinking you might also see at home. That's the all or nothing thinking, which is very common cognitive distortion with ADHD, meaning that an example might be that you might see at home is if there's 20 minutes before you have to start to get ready to leave for, you have to go somewhere, a doctor's appointment, let's say. That child might say, okay, well, I'm not going to start my homework because I have to leave in 20 minutes and I won't be able to finish it. So they see it as very black and white. Either they need to finish all of their homework in one sitting, or they're not going to start it at all. So this black and white thinking can often get in the way. I often challenge my clients, and I'm like, oh, that sounds like black and white thinking. What would be more along the lines of gray? To see if they can come up with a happy medium. Because if they just at least started their homework or started a task, that's infinitely more than if they didn't start it at all. So our ADHDers tend to live life more intensely. We've talked about the energy management. They tend to be extremely sensitive. They're sensitive to criticism, and perceived criticism. They're sensitive to rejection and perceived rejection. They have this heightened sensitivity, some of our clients, due to this rejection sensitivity dysphoria, where they perceive that they have been rejected by other people, and it's an extreme emotional reaction to that. They have extreme sensitivity with emotions. They can sometimes be over the top happy or over the top sad. They just tend to experience emotions more intensely. They're also sensitive to light in the environment, light, sound, smells, visual clutter. So at home, in the area where your child is trying to get their homework done, a bunch of visual clutter probably isn't optimal. Some of my adults, can only be in the grocery store for 10 minutes because of all the environmental pieces that just totally stresses out their sensory system. And also, many of our kids are extremely sensitive to kind of that tactile or the visual or the auditory or the smell sensations. But good news is there's help. Oops, sorry. There are strategies that we can create. There's structures that we can create. We can create an environment that's consistent and predictable. We can head off problems if we plan things in advance. We can define expectations for them, and we can create a success team. If you haven't already started to talk to your child about a success team, I highly recommend having that as a conversation. Even young kids could have this as a conversation. So I oftentimes will hold up my hand. Sometimes I'll have them trace it, their hand. But who are the people we can turn to when we need help? And that might be a teacher, it might be a grandparent, it might be a neighbor, it might be whomever, right? But we need to teach our kids that everybody needs a success team. I need one, you need one, we all need a success team. And if we start to think about that at an early age, then they're more likely to reach out to those people later on. So understanding our child with ADHD is about getting curious. It's a shifting from that why to I wonder what's going on for my child and how can I help my child with that. So when we start to look at our kids, I would love for you to shift how you currently see your child to now seeing your child through this ADHD executive function lens. Again, those executive functions are the things that we need in order to get from point A to point B in any given moment. The planning, the organizing, the time management. But in this ADHD executive function lens is not only the executive function challenges, but a brain activation piece. Again, we have to have the brain activated, that arousal, that optimal arousal, and a lagging skills piece. Our kids, quite frankly, just don't know how to do some things that we think they should know how to do. And so we have to stop and ask ourselves, what is going on for our child right now, and how can I best support him? I was talking to a parent last night, and her son is 17. Earlier, I talked about a garbage can, but I'm going to talk about their kitchen. And he's constantly putting things in the wrong places in the kitchen. And I actually said to them last night, I said, well, does he really know where it all actually goes? Especially the things that you only use occasionally. And they're like, maybe not. And so they're going to do a tour of the kitchen with their 17-year-old to make sure that he actually knows where everything goes. That's that lagging skill piece. And they were thinking about creating a little cheat sheet for those one-offs types of things that you rarely use, like a turkey baster that you may only use at Thanksgiving time, and putting that inside the door of where to put something when we don't know where it goes. So instead of looking at it like, okay, my kid doesn't care, or my kid's being willful, and disrespectful, we want to stop and say, what's going on? What is happening and how can I best support? So this is where we start helping build the executive functions, where we're actually working together to create the support necessary. Where you start, when our kids were babies, we did everything for them. Then we kind of, as they got older, we started to show them, like this dad is doing. He's showing a younger child kind of how that he's going to swing his arms through to hit the ball. Then we started to cue them, like, how are you going to know when you need to be ready? Or what's it going to be like to be done? And then finally, we get them to an independence. Well, we can kind of go up, take it one step forward, one step back. That's just the fact of raising kids. When we raise kids, it's kind of a marathon approach, not a sprint. But as we help them along the path to independence, we need to build this scaffolding, which are supports that we need to develop to allow the executive, to help the executive functions continue to develop as well. So we're going to be putting these strategies and these supports in place to help shore up some of the areas of challenge in those executive functions. Again, we can't always start with independence, right? We have to teach. We have to do sometimes still, and then we have to show and do it together, and then we have to cue. I get so many calls from parents saying, my child cannot clean his room. You should see what his bedroom looks like. Well, the fact of the matter is that the executive function of organization can be very challenging, and it's probably a good bet that the child doesn't necessarily know where everything belongs. So in that particular instance, when we're talking about that organization, I say everything needs a home. And so it takes this doing and this showing and this cueing over and over and over again to be able to reach this independence, where you can say, okay, go, it's Saturday at this time. What do you need to be doing now? And then they say, oh, that's right. I need to go clean my room. We tend to withdraw our support too early. So as you're working with your child with ADHD executive function challenges, make sure you stay in the game a little bit longer than you think you need to actually get the habit or the skill up and going so it can be sustainable. When we start to talk about improving the executive function skills, we want to start outside the child. Okay, so we want to change the environment before we change our student, which might mean setting up an appropriate workplace where the student can get his or her homework done before we ask the student to change and adapt to whatever situation we put that child in. So it's things that are external that we want to do. So maybe we in a part of the house, maybe we make it so that it's not as distracting by putting up a cardboard divider, or maybe we make it so that there's fidgets available. That's changing the environment before we're asking the child to change. We also want to start with the external cues before we go into internal cueing, and that means we want to help cue our child to do certain things before we can expect that to become internal. So when I'm working with all my ADHD clients, my number one question before the end of this session is, how are you going to remember to do that? They have to create some sort of external cue for themselves. That might be a reminder set on their phone. It might be a sticky note. It might be putting a calendar next to the coffee pot as an adult to remember to look at your calendar. It might be any number of things that is going to get your attention, cause you to pause and say, oh yeah, what was I supposed to do here? Again, going back to that dopamine reward pathway, we need to get a stronger stimuli to activate that reward pathway. So that extrinsic motivation, working towards something outside of us, needs to happen before we can become intrinsically motivated. So in order to change the environment, you can also modify the task or the way the student completes the task. So if a child was asked to fill in the blank worksheet and they're having trouble with spelling, so maybe they can create a picture that would show that all the knowledge, but it's just modifying that task or the way the student completes it. Or I know that with the iPad, you can kind of take pictures with a certain program. You can take pictures of a worksheet, and then you can allow the student to type right into the fill in the blanks. So that again would be changing or modifying the task and the way the student completes the task. Again, you want to modify the environment, but you also want to modify the way the adult responds to the student or your child, the way you respond to your child, and come from a place of curiosity of how can I help you? What do you think you might need? So here we go into the practical tips and strategies to promote this productivity. Because remember, the executive functions and ADHD is all about the doing. What we want to avoid is this ADHD tornado. So if you look down at the bottom of that tornado, it's just an ADHD challenge, which is just a challenge, right? We can overcome that challenge with support and strategies. If we do not interrupt it with a strategy, structure, changing the environment, modifying the task, helping that child, what we see happen is the child starts to do that rumination of, okay, this is never going to work for me. I don't remember. I'm not successful. I'm no good at this. I'm lazy. And they're going to get frustrated and shut down. So as that negative self-talk increases, as their anxiety increases, their executive functions are going to go offline. So we want to try to insert a strategy right down when we identify an ADHD challenge. And one of the areas that we see pretty much all of our kids having an issue with is this planning and prioritization, the creating the roadmap that's going to get us to the goal and deciding what's important to focus on first and then what's also not important. So for younger students, you could do something as easy as, having magnets that they can just slide over. Here's a list of magnets that they have to do, of the tasks they have to do. And when they're done, they just slide the magnet over. And that's probably one of the most basic forms of planning. But they're still getting the idea of, here I have to do something, and here it's done. And the picture on the bottom right just shows flaps, kind of the same thing. Then they get they have a magnet on both, so they get kind of clipped together once they've done it. So again, we're creating this picture of done. This was my to-do, and here's my done. Once the students start to get a little bit older, it's helpful to have a plan of how they're going to do after school, and sometimes how they're going to do their weekends as well. I fully and firmly believe in this power of 15 minutes, where a student comes home and checks like Google Classroom and any other teacher website. They want to make sure they compare it to their agenda. They want to make sure that they're adding any tests or long-term projects to their calendar, and they're coming up with a homework plan. And so I believe one of the things that you got sent out was kind of that homework plan and what that might look like. One thing I like to do is our students often forget about tests, papers, projects because they're too far away in time-wise. And so it helps to help them think about, okay, here's your homework, because most of the time kids will say, I don't have any homework, even though they have a test coming up. Here's your homework, and here's any pieces that you need to study or you need to prepare for your project if you've broken the project up into smaller pieces. So I like something like this because then it keeps this study project plan paper time in the mind's eye, so to speak, up front, versus letting it get lost in that later land. Because what I'll say to a student is, I'll hold up my clock and I say, okay, I don't see later on my clock. I just see numbers. So our kids are always wanting to push things later to later to later, but there's really no later on a clock. So you can see a more simplistic schedule in the left. Walking through the day, I just love Sarah Ward and Kristen Jacobson have this actually as a full-blown up timeline that kids can actually walk on, which is really cool. But here it's just helpful for a student to be able to see what's happening after school. What is the afternoon going to look like so that they can then anticipate it and start to understand what goes into formulating a plan. As our kids get older, I love these schedules where we're looking at a week at a time. They're also going to have to look at a day at a time as well as when they get, up into the middle and high school. So they make sure they get their daily assignments done. But this gives them a look at how their week actually looks. And you'll notice that the white space is that student's available time to work on homework. So we're always looking to help our students see their available time and then helping them plan how they're going to use that available time. So some questions might be, wow, I see that you have basketball 3 nights this week. What do you think you might need to do to make sure that you're getting all your homework done? How do you think you might need to structure your afternoon so that you make sure you get your assignments done? How are you going to know what's most important or what you should start with first? Once I get up to the college age when I'm working with students, we really start to look at what has the biggest impact on a grade. Yeah, we look at what's due, closest, but outside of what's due closest, we have to look at what's going to give us the biggest bang, because sometimes our kids have gotten themselves into a hole and we need to kind of triage it. One of my favorite times is a family meeting time. I recommend this to all families. It's a time where you get together. Our kids learn best through live modeling. And so if we all get together and the adults model what it's like to create the weekly schedule, using that language of, oh, wow, looks like on Monday I have to work till 5. So I need to start thinking about dinner because I might not be home in time to make dinner. So what could I do ahead of time? All that language is fantastic for kids to hear. It's language of time and planning. Our kids often don't have that language. So anything they can hear you doing is wonderful. So you can make it fun. It doesn't have to be torturous. It can be 10 minutes. It can be 15 minutes. You could have cocoa and cookies. Some people bring their paper and pencil. I'm totally paper and pencil. Other people are totally digital. It doesn't matter. If you have just a young child, then just bring a week. Just have a strip of a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and maybe all you do is write one thing on each day. just to start having the kids hear and experience what's involved in a plan. So my favorite, and I hope it becomes your favorite, is Get Ready, Do Done, again by Sarah Ward and Kristen Jacobson, two wonderful speech pathologists. Speech pathologists, OTs, also work with executive functions. And they created this Get Ready, Do Done. I use this with students. I use this with young students. I use this with older students. I have a client today who's considering the military. We kind of worked through this, like what has to happen in order to make that decision. I use this with my adults. So a lot of times our kids with ADHD and our adults with ADHD aren't able to see what done is going to look like. Can you imagine, like, if you start to build, let's say you were supposed to build, I don't know, let's say a doghouse, but you had no idea like what it was supposed to look like. Somebody just gave you all the lumber and all the nails, or actually probably better is somebody just dropped off all these pieces to a swing set and said, go for it. Because I actually have that as a reality for an adult client. Somebody dropped off all the pieces of a swing set taken apart, and they have no idea how to put it back together. So getting a picture, trying to find a picture of what that looks like, gives them something to navigate towards. Same thing goes for our students. We need something to navigate towards. So let's take a look. So what we start with is working my plan backwards. We always want to start with what done looks like. So we start, let's say your student has a poster, has to be done about Daniel Boone. And it has to have 3 pictures. It has to have at least 2 captions or 2 paragraphs describing Daniel Boone. It has to have words about him and dates. So hopefully your child's teacher will have given your child a rubric with all the things that have to everything the student has to have in order to achieve a good grade. Rubrics are incredibly helpful when you're going to create this done picture. Step 2 is we have to figure out what the steps are. From the steps, then we have to figure out materials we need or the people we need to help, right? Go back to that comic strip. We needed somebody clearly to get to the grocery store several days ahead of having to bring a Guatemalan dessert to school. So here we are, we're just planning. We're working a plan backwards. We're just in the planning phase. And then we turn around and we execute forward. We work the plan. We find that clean workspace. We gather materials, ask for help if we need it. We start going through the steps in order. We want to set a clock for how long we think it's going to take. So I have my analog clock. So if I think a step is going to take 40 minutes and it's 5 o'clock now, I'm going to put start here. I'm going to put finish on the 40-minute mark. I'm going to mark midway. And earlier I put, here it is. So what I'll do for my student, and this is going to be harder for you to see because it's purple, I apologize. But if my student thinks that step 1 is going to take 40 minutes, I'm going to go straight up that minute hand and count 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, so the student knows where to put the finish. Then I'm going to draw that line back in to the center of the clock, and I'm going to color this, shade it all in, so that my student can see, or my child can see the minute hand start to move and understand that time is moving forward. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we get into time management. But it's really important that the student starts to see how long they think a task is going to take and what time they think they're going to actually be done, right? Like if it's going to take 40 minutes and we eat at 6 o'clock, oh, we're only going to have 20 minutes left before we have to eat. So we'll have to see if we actually can get it done in 40 minutes. And that's where the midpoint check-in is. You want to set a timer for halfway. Say, am I on track? Do I need to adjust my pace or do I need to adjust my time estimation? Also, this midpoint is where you check for time robbers, those things that are going to get you off task, like cell phones, screen time, anything digital, and just general noise in the house could possibly get you off task. So we want to set a midpoint so we don't end up having our students sit there for 40 minutes having done nothing. And then when we get to step 6, which is back to the done, we want to compare. Like, how will I know that I'm done? Well, I'll check my rubric if my teacher gave me a rubric and make sure I have all the things that listed on the rubric in my poster. But the best thing about this is it doesn't just have to be for school. It can be helping your child get ready for baseball or any sport. It can be helping your child get ready for school. So I'll put a picture of a student in that done, right? All dressed and ready for school. Sometimes I'll just put a backpack of what the backpack needs to look like inside or what needs to be in that backpack. Again, there's that picture of done that you want to navigate towards. Okay, let's back it up. What steps do I need to take in order to get to this picture of done where I'm walking out the door and walking to go get to the bus? Okay, what materials will I need? Okay, let's gather the materials. Let's work my steps. I need to get my underwear on, my jeans on, my shirt on, my jacket on, my socks and my shoes and my backpack, and then I'm ready. Do I look like that picture? If so, I'm ready to walk out the door. If not, I have to figure out what I'm missing. One of the best places to use it is cooking. Now, I don't know about you, but I often gravitate to recipes that have a picture, so I know what it's supposed to look like. It doesn't, by far, my recipes don't end up like those pictures, but at least I understand what I'm navigating towards. Same thing with our kids. So here's a picture of a pizza. Okay, let's break it down. Whatever we want on top, we've put on top. Let's break down the steps. What are we going to have to figure out? Are we going to buy the crust or are we going to make the crust? That involves, the different steps, right? We'd have to add more steps if we were going to make it. What materials are we going to need? Okay, let's gather materials, work through the steps and get to our picture of done. So this type of planning is just wonderful for anything. It could be for packing, for a vacation, just about anything. You could do it to teach dogs tricks. Teaching a dog a trick is one of the best ways to build executive function skills of planning. This time management time is such a mystery with ADHD. It's the capacity to estimate how much time you have and how to allocate it and stay within the time limit and deadline. But it also involves a sense that time's important. With ADHD, I'm not 100% sure why, but the ADHD body just does not feel the passage of time. I mentioned earlier today that I had a 35-year-old client who bought an analog clock for the watch for the first time. And she said to me, Christine, this is the first time in my life that I understand what an hour is. So our kids don't understand what 5 minutes will be, what 10 minutes will be. If you tell them, get ready in 10 minutes, you might as well have not said it at all, honestly, because it's just going to get you frustrated because your student isn't getting ready. It doesn't mean anything to them. They need to be shown what that 10 minutes is. So our students do now and not now. That's that later piece, right? The future falls off into a black hole. They're more interested in the instant gratification. That brain is scanning for anything more interesting. And their time horizon has to creep up so close in order to see it and get activated by it. And what I mean by that is let's take a student that has a science test in a week from now. it's probably not until the day before that that student will actually see that he or she has that science test and will start to study, which we know is not the right way to go about studying based on brain research and brain science. So it takes a task or an activity almost getting right up to the student before they're able to really see it, start to consider it, and then start to do something about it. So as parents and teachers, we want to help those students see that that's coming up, that's coming up, that's coming up. Okay, we're getting closer. Let's help you break it up into chunks. Which chunks are you going to do on which days to get it done so it doesn't feel like such a big assignment? But we have to start working on it now so that you're not rushing at the last minute. I find this chart fascinating. It's the child's ability to anticipate the future. This is for neurotypical. I always say I don't even know if there is such a thing as neurotypical. In our industry, we say an ADHD brain or a neurotypical brain. But we all have our own uniquenesses. That's why I put neurotypical in air quotes. But I think for an 8-year-old, they can only anticipate the future from 8 to 12 hours from now. So if a teacher says something to a student, to the students in the class, hey, we are doing this tomorrow, there's a good bet that by the time tomorrow comes around, some of them then will have forgotten that. Again, going up to the 17 to 23-year-olds, they're only able to anticipate the future in 2 to 3 weeks. And then the 23 to 25 is only 3 to 5 weeks out. When we ask our kids, in the 16 to 17 to 20 range, like, what do you want to do the next 4 years of your life, right? Where do you want to go and spend school the next 4 years of your life? Well, guess what? They're really only able to anticipate, into the future 2 to 3 weeks from then. So when we're talking about time, I mentioned in my clock that the minute hand and the second hand, are constantly moving. We call that the sweep of time. That's why we want to have analog clocks all throughout our house. Digital clocks only show the here and the now. So if I look at my digital clock, I see that it's 8:09. That's all it tells me is it's 8:09. It tells me nothing else in relationship to anything, to any other time. An analog clock helps the child understand that time continues regardless of what they're doing, and that this sweep of time is important to pay attention to so that you don't run out of it. So analog clocks help develop that understanding that time passes. Now, some kids do feel the passage of time. They don't stop long enough to acknowledge it, like either mentally, the mental hyperactivity or the physical hyperactivity. They don't stop long enough to say, oh yeah, I'm on to the next hour. But we want to have as many visual representations of time and time moving as we can for our students. Just a quick tidbit. If you're going to do something like this with your child, if you get an analog clock that has a plastic face, make sure you get the vis-a-vis pens. These are the wet erase pens. On a plastic-faced clock, you have to use the vis-a-vis. Otherwise, the other markers won't come off. If you do get a glass-faced clock, you can use dry erase markers and they will erase just fine on a glass-faced clock. But if it's just plastic, make sure you order or pick up some vis-a-vis, which is the wet erase markers. And then you can do that as well. I like where on the right-hand side, how this one family broke it up into different colors. So that sweep of time, in the green was homework time. And then in the pink was playtime, moving to family time, and then bedtime. I like that visual representation so the kids could see when, okay, here's the hour, here's the hour hand. Where am I? Am I in homework time? Am I in the playtime? And then the minute hand continues to go around. One thing we didn't talk about earlier today is transitions, because in school, there aren't a whole lot of transitions. I mean, as you get into the older grades, you change classes. Some classes in elementary might go to music. With COVID, it's anyone's, who knows what they're doing as far as changing. But what parents can do is help children understand that transition time. I can't tell you how many college students have a 9:20 class and they are leaving their dorm room at 9:20. And they have to maybe even take a bus, right? Because their campus is so big, to get to class. Well, that's not going to work. And then they wonder why they're continually late. Or I had a mom continually late for yoga class because she always did that one last thing. Let me try to get one more thing in, forgetting how long it takes her to transition out of the house, get in the car, and drive to the yoga studio. And she was so frustrated with herself. She was so mad at herself, until we were able to get help her with that transition, get an accurate time of how long it takes to get there so that she could be on time. So transitions are biggies. So talk about that with your kids. I come from Boston, and sometimes to get into Boston, it was a 20-minute ride. And sometimes to get into Boston, it was an hour and a half to 2-hour ride, just depending, right? You have to be able to take that into account, those transitions. In order for students to be successful, they have to understand that transitions take time. So when you tell them that you're leaving the house at a certain time and you help them see that time, they know that it's going to take them some time. You're talking to them about how long do you think it's going to take you to get ready to be able to leave the house. That has to be taken into account, that transition, in order to get out the door on time. Different estimating time exercises you can do just for fun or to help your child start to formulate a self-awareness. Like, how long does it take you to make your bed? Estimate it and then actually time it. How long does it take you to brush your teeth? Estimate it and actually time it. Same thing with one sheet of homework you like, one page of a book, get your clothes and gears ready, take a shower, whatever it might be. You can do an estimation and time sheet to help them start to form a self-awareness. We can't change a behavior unless we're aware that something needs changing. We have to create that awareness first, that these things are important, like a transition or how long it takes to make your bed, how that time is important in order for our kids to have a sense of time. Another thing that is really interesting is I talk about clocks here, definitely analog, that will help give the passage of time. Music playlists are really great timers as well. If your students like to listen to music while they're doing their homework or doing chores or whatever, have them make a playlist. Have them make a 10-minute playlist for the shower. Have them make a 20-minute playlist for homework. And then they get up and they take a break and then they come back to another 20-minute playlist. If they don't shuffle the music, each song lasts about 3 to 4 minutes. So it's a great way to have music act as a timer. So eventually they'll start to understand what that song is halfway through and use that to gauge, okay, well, that song is playing, so I'm halfway through that 20-minute mark. The time timer is great as well. It gives a very visual, like, this is what a half hour looks like. It's a red disc, and as the time passes, the disc disappears. What it doesn't do is it doesn't show you or your child what that passage of time is in relationship to time in general. That just gives you like a 10-minute, 15-minute, however long you set it for, that just gives you that visual. If you use something more like this, which you can see on the right, then that shows you how this activity is interacting with time. Like, okay, when I'm done by 5:40, I better start getting ready for dinner or whatever comes next. And then go ahead. We looked at one already, so I won't spend much time. Go ahead and make it fun. Like, have the kids involved. Go ahead and make it fun. Do it during a family meeting. You could probably use permanent marker on that, or the dry erase too, if you want to be able to change it. So organization is always a challenge, right? I hear it from everybody. Kids are losing homework, their rooms are a mess, they can't find their shoes, they can't find their socks. Here's a quick trick. I always tell parents to keep a basket of clean socks by the door so your kids don't have to go back upstairs to get them, because inevitably they'll become distracted and start to run late. So that's a way of modifying the environment, right? Instead of asking the child to change, right? Just keep a basket of clean socks by the back door and off you go. So one of the things I love is a launch pad. Oops, the other picture didn't show up. I apologize. This was my launch pad at one point. This is right by the door. You can see some electronics are charging. You can see there's pencils in the glass jar. There's cough drops in one of the tins. There's a lunchbox, my daughter's backpack, and my purse, and a water bottle. And so that we get everything to the launch pad the night before that we're going to need in order to launch our morning successfully. So we don't want to be running around the house trying to figure out where everything is. We want to get it onto a launch pad so that we can launch in the morning to make it successful. Oh, there's the other one. I had no idea I even did that. So that's a different form of a launch pad. I caution you about going to Pinterest, right? Pinterest can drive you nuts. Make it simple. Make it so it has the fewest obstacles. The biggest thing with organization is have it require the fewest number of steps, which means don't put lids on boxes that you want things to be put away in. That lid and somebody having to take off that lid is the difference between somebody actually putting something away and something not put away. Other types of ways you can organize things. The one on the far left was actually an old basket out of my dishwasher. It had different colored pens. It had protractors, calculator, highlighters, all the different writing utensils, scissors. It had erasers in there that you can't see. So we want to have something that our kids can bring to home where they're going to do their homework, so that they're not constantly getting up and going back. It's hard for our kids. It takes them longer to get back into an activity. So the fewer times they have to get up to get materials, the better off they are. So if you can have these things in some place, or like the wheeled caddy, they just wheel it to where they're going to do homework. There's paper in there, there's writing, there's markers, there's everything that they're going to need. Getting some system like that will minimize the distraction for homework. Also helping them organize their backpacks and showing them how to do that. I love the Mead Flax. It has a soft spine. I love that for high school. It has a soft spine so you can fold it all the way back like a spiral notebook. I like students having 1 2-pocket folder in that per class. Sometimes when you get to the high school level, you have to have one of these Mead folders for morning classes and one for the afternoon classes. There's notebook paper in between. But we want to help our kids start to keep some sort of system for organizing their schoolwork. We want to help them start to put dates on all their papers, because one year my son didn't organize. It was before I knew about how to help him that way. My daughter and I had his papers for pretty much the whole year of history scattered across the entire living room floor, trying to put like subjects together so he could study for his midterm or final. So if you can help your students set up a system whereby they put 2-pocket folders in there, the things that go, the things that teachers hand out that day, sometimes teachers hand out PowerPoints. When you get home, 3-hole punch them, then put them into the binder. At the end of each unit, I love having our students take the study guide the teacher might have given and any worksheets and written notes, clip them together, put them in this file box under like history or English, whatever the subject is, so that when they come to have to study for midterms or finals, they're going to be nice and neatly organized there. They're not going to have to look for them at all. Working memory is the ability to hold information in your mind while doing a task with it. Okay, it incorporates the ability to draw on past learning or experience to apply it to the situation at hand. So for our students, this is the mind's Post-it note. We all have them. We all compensate for them. I mean, how many of us write grocery lists or like what we have to do that day lists? That's working memory. So if I were to say the brains can only store so much, we want to break tasks into smaller chunks. We want to provide written directions, like checklists, to-do lists, and we want to develop routines. Like, what do you have to do to get ready in the morning? What do you have to do to get ready at night? What's your homework routine? Because once we develop something as a routine, it becomes automatic and the executive functions don't have to engage in it. So helping kids write it down, helping kids with different academic strategies. So sometimes I'll put where you can see the addition, subtraction, multiplication. Some of our students have a hard time with word problems. So why not put the words that mean addition in front of them so they don't have to hold on to that. I'll often show kids my phone, and I have very few apps on it, but I tell them if I had all the apps open, what would happen to my phone? Oh, it would freeze or glitch. That's exactly with the working memory. We can't have too much, we can't store too much in our head because they're just going to slip off that Post-it notes. So having things external, again, those external cues to help a student become successful. The thing in the middle is called a Smart Pen. I love it. It records a lecture, so you'd have to get permission to use it. But you can write just a few words, but you can touch it anywhere in the notebook on any word you've written, and they'll pick the lecture up right then and there. It's fantastic for especially high school and college students. Emotional control. This is the ability to manage emotions, to achieve goals, complete tasks, or control and direct behavior. This is a toughie. I'm sure I know I've had my series of meltdowns with my kids and myself at times, right? Especially at the end of the day. This is called an anxiety curve. And what we really want to do is we put strategies before anxiety gets too high. Okay, so when we start, or our kids start to experience anxiety, we want to get a strategy, in there before we reach, like levels 4 and levels 5. Once we've gone above and beyond, the point of no return, you're going to just have to wait for your student to regulate again in order to be able to use any of those executive functions. But we do have time. So it's teaching our students, like when they start to feel anxious or start to feel stressed or start to feel overwhelmed, it's having conversations with them, that they start to understand the clues that their body is telling them. Most inattentive ADDers are so caught up in their head that they don't even realize their bodies hardly. So they've never really stopped to think about, where do I feel stress? So having conversations like that and helping students understand those early warning signals are so important. Because at that point, then you guys could work together and maybe grab something that you've put into a basket of stress reducing, tasks or activities. You can go grab that strategy before everything loses control. Another way that a parent can help is doing, some of the breathing. So down at the bottom is that in and out breathing, that figure 8 breathing, where the child just continually draws its finger over and they breathe out on one side and breathe in on the other. If you laminate that, you can keep that in the homework area or at night. I've had parents do that with their kids at night with a storybook. Helping your child anticipate triggers is a biggie. So if you know that you're going somewhere that might be triggering to your child, have a conversation ahead of time and either help the child understand that there will be triggers there and what can you do about it, or see if you can remove as many as possible. A pause button we do with our students a lot of times, and that's just the Model Magic Crayola. It's like a foam clay that dries, and so we have the students keep that around them so then they can remember to take a pause when they start to feel agitated. Another thing is starting to attack those negative thoughts, like I'm bad at, I can't do it, I'm not smart. Okay, how can we flip that? What kind of help do you need there? Let's take a look, let's flip it, and let's reframe the situation. A lot of schools use a bunch of different techniques. The size of my problem is one, zones of regulation, the 5-point scale. There are a variety of different things you can use out there. If you look on Pinterest under any of the zones of regulation, 5-point scale, size of my problem, the feelings thermometer, you'll find all that on Pinterest if you want to start using that in your own home. But, you want students to start on the left-hand side, this is zones of regulation. So the blue is that sleepy, tired, sick. That's just, they're going to be kind of dysregulated there. They're not going to have accurate access to their executive function. That green is the ideal time for learning and executive functioning. And then they're going to start to escalate up to that exploding point. It's really helpful as a family if you guys have shared language around that. So sometimes families will say, oh, I'm in the blue zone. What do I need to do in order to get myself in the green zone? Or I'm feeling myself going into the yellow zone. Even parents, right? I'm feeling myself going into the yellow and orange zone. What do I need to come back to that green zone? I'm going to go through this really quickly because I've kept you so long. Homework battles. We want to move from I can't stand it to the girl who's actually smiling doing her homework. But as parents, I just want you to keep in mind all the different steps that it takes. It takes every single executive function to complete homework, to get it home, to do it, to get it back, and to get it turned in. So it's not just a really easy, it comes home, it goes back. No, there's so many places that could have breakdown and where the child can fall apart or the cycle can fall apart. So you want to make sure that you and the teachers are supporting the child through that cycle. If your child needs an after-school routine, here's a sample of one. Did you give them a break and a snack? We want our kids to eat protein. Protein is really good for the brain. It's good for our kids with ADHD. So did they get a snack with protein? Asking yourself, does your child have a clutter-free area? Is the workspace appropriate? Do they need movement to focus? And then, this is just a sample. Some of our students forget to hand in their homework. So you'll see at 5:45, the student is taking a photograph of their homework. We do have some students take a photograph of their homework and email it to the teacher in addition to bringing in the hard copy, just in case that hard copy doesn't make it to school. Also, putting papers in folders. You can have have a homework folder and let this, have the kids put it in there. I always say homework is not done till everything is in their folders and the folders are in their backpack. Homework is not, if you still have homework out, that means it's not done. Here's a way you can do that get ready, do done that we talked about with Sarah Ward as a homework workspace. You put all the materials that you're going to need for your homework. You take them one by one and work on them and then put them in the homework folder. And above all, get creative and physical. So use all the study senses, the eyes, the ears, the mouth, the hand. My son used to be on a balance board juggling, and I would quiz him, his history vocab. Get creative, let them draw pictures. For my daughter's ceramics final, she drew an entire whiteboard full of all the vocab that she needed to know and all the different steps to create the different things. So, allow them to walk around, allow them to fidget, allow them to draw what they're learning. I have the bathtub there because I read someplace that a mom even allows her son to do homework in a dry bathtub, not a wet one, because the ADHD brain loves shiny and new. So it's a shiny new place. Why not do it? Right? Our kids are out of the box thinkers, so go with it. Again, here's the homework station. We want to be able to bring it to a clean workspace and then put it back so that we're not cluttering up our workspace. And then these are just more examples of different types of homework stations, similar to what I've already showed you. Please get creative, but above all, parent self-care is critical. Just like they say in the airlines, you need to put your oxygen mask on first. So please make sure you're taking care of yourself, because if you're not meeting your own needs, it's going to be really hard to meet your child's needs. See if you can slow down, maybe make a new tradition, Pancake Day, No Technology Tuesday. But it's really helpful if you know your own values, your own strengths, your own triggers, and your own fears. Because as parents, we are worried about our kids. We wonder if they're going to be sleeping on our couch for the rest of their life, right? And we future forecast. That's just what we do. But if you can take your breath, if you can take your self-care, if you put that in play, it will be more manageable. It will be easier to manage your interactions with your child. And above all, you and your kids have the same goal in mind. Both you and your kids want both success and independence. So I hope this helped you understand a little bit more about your child, where their come from was, the neurology of ADHD, and a glimpse into those executive functions and how you could support your kids so you have those healthy parent-child relationships. So thank you so much.
Thank you again, Christine, for your great information. It was simple to understand, very practical, very understandable strategies that can be very useful both in the home setting and the school setting, whether you're a parent of a child with ADHD or whether yourself as an individual with ADHD or whether you're teaching or parenting a child as well. So thank you so much for being a part of us this evening as part of our Cares for Parents series. It was very appreciated, Christine.
Oh,